There is a moment in the ministry of exorcism that no one prepares you for. Not the smell, not the voices, not the physical violence that erupts in a room where something ancient is being confronted and cornered. Those things you can read about in a limited way in the accounts of priests who came before you. You can brace for them intellectually, even if your body never fully cooperates when the moment arrives. The moment I am talking about is different. It happened during one of the most severe possession cases I have ever worked. The individual on the table had been in this state for what we would later determine was years of progressive deepening oppression before the full possession manifested. The room had gone through 3 of the phases I have described in other contexts: the smell, the temperature shift, the eyes. We were deep into the right. The entity had been pressed by the authority of the prayers to speak. And it did. It did not threaten me. It did not try to frighten me with the things these entities typically attempt during this stage of the confrontation. Instead, it paused. And then it said in a voice that carried with it an unmistakable quality of contempt, something that stopped the entire room. It described hell, not as warning, not as something it feared, but the way a man who has lived in a city for 10,000 years would describe the streets to a tourist who has just arrived, with the casual, intimate, bone-deep familiarity of someone for whom that place is home. And what it described was nothing like what any of us had imagined. I will get to what it said, but I need you to understand something first, because what I'm about to tell you is not a ghost story. It is not religious theater. It is a composite of what I have encountered across 20-plus years of exorcism ministry, cross-referenced with the theological tradition that the Church has held since its founding, and confirmed in ways that I still find difficult to speak about without pausing to collect myself. My name is Chad Ripperger. I am a Catholic priest, a Thomistic philosopher, a formally trained and authorized exorcist. I did not approach this particular topic because it was theologically interesting or because I thought it would make for compelling content. I am addressing it because in my work, I have encountered too many souls who have no real understanding of what they are moving toward if they do not change course. And the demonic, in its moments of compelled revelation, has provided details about that destination that the Church's tradition confirms, and that no rational person should simply ignore. Stay with me, because what comes next is going to disturb you. Not because I want to disturb you, because the truth is disturbing, and someone has to say it without softening it into something comfortable and therefore useless. Let us begin. What every priest learns, and almost none will say, I want to tell you what the Church actually teaches about hell. Not the cultural version, not the version filtered through Renaissance paintings of devils with pitchforks or modern theology that has quietly decided the whole concept is too uncomfortable to engage seriously. The actual teaching, the theological structure, what the greatest minds the Church has ever produced actually concluded after lifetimes of prayer, study, and in some cases, direct mystical encounter. Because until you understand what the Church actually believes, you cannot understand why what I witnessed in those exorcism rooms is so significant. Hell, in the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas and the broader Catholic tradition, is not a metaphor. It is not a psychological state. It is not a symbol for the experience of radical separation from community or meaning. It is a real place, a real state, a real condition of existence that begins at the moment of final, unrepented, and unreconciled separation from God at death. And it is permanent, not temporary, not provisional, not subject to revision based on accumulated good intentions or the mercy of a God who eventually overlooks the will of a creature that freely chose rejection. This is where modern culture has made its most dangerous error. It has decided that a loving God would never allow permanent consequences. It has confused love with permissiveness. It has confused mercy with the abolition of justice. And in doing so, it has removed the one warning sign that has historically been the most effective motivator for the conversion of souls who were drifting toward the edge. When I entered seminary, I was not a man who had experienced hell in any direct sense. I was a student of ideas, a student of arguments, a student of the theological architecture that supports the Church's claims. I believed in hell the way I believed in the existence of Antarctica. I had not been there. I had never spoken to anyone who had been there. but the evidence of its existence was compelling enough, and the testimony of people I trusted was specific enough, that denying it would have required a motivated irrationality I was not willing to adopt. Then I began to encounter the demonic in direct ministerial context, and something shifted. The demons know hell. They know it the way you know your own bedroom in the dark. They have been there. They are, in some sense I will explain in a moment, inextricably connected to it, even when they are operating in the material world on their various assignments. And when they are pressed, when the authority of the right forces them past their preferred deceptions, they sometimes say things about that place that the entire room absorbs in a silence that lasts much longer than it should. I want to tell you what the tradition teaches first, and then I want to tell you what I have witnessed that confirmed, expanded, and in certain specific ways deepened that teaching in ways that I could not have arrived at through theology alone. The traditional theological account of hell identifies what the church calls the pains of hell. There are two categories, and the distinction between them matters enormously because most people only think about one of them. The first is the pain of loss, the poena damni. This is the permanent, total, and irrecoverable loss of the beatific vision, the direct experience of God, which is the only thing the human soul was created to ultimately receive, and which, once lost permanently, leaves in its place something that the tradition describes not merely as emptiness, but as a positive wound. The absence of what you were made for, experienced not as blankness but as a tearing, a permanent deprivation whose intensity exceeds any physical suffering precisely because the soul knows, in the full clarity of its unshielded intellect, exactly what it has lost and that it will never recover it. St. Thomas teaches that this alone, purely this, absent anything else, would constitute a suffering beyond the capacity of language to fully communicate, because the soul in that state is experiencing with total clarity what it chose against when it still had the capacity to choose otherwise. The second is what the tradition calls the pain of sense, the physical dimension, the positive suffering that accompanies the spiritual. I am not going to construct a theological argument for this in a format like this one, because that would take considerably longer than we have. But I will tell you that the Church's teaching, confirmed across Scripture, the Fathers, and the greatest theological minds the tradition has produced, is that this dimension is real, and that it begins immediately, on the first day. What does the first day look like? That is the question I want to spend the next several sections answering, because what the theological tradition says, what the mystics have described, what I have heard compelled from the mouths of entities who know this place by direct experience, when these three streams of information converge on the same description, that convergence is not something I am able to dismiss, and I do not think you should dismiss it either. The first hour, I want to be precise here, not dramatic, precise. The Church teaches that the particular judgment, the individual judgment of each soul at the moment of death, distinct from the final general judgment at the end of time, Dars, is instantaneous. It occurs the moment the soul separates from the body. There is no interval of unconsciousness, no transition period, no gradual dawning of awareness. The soul, the moment it departs from the body, is immediately in the full possession of its intellectual capacities, operating without the limitations of a physical brain. It knows where it is going, it knows why. This is one of the most underappreciated and most important details in the entire theological account of what follows death. The soul does not arrive at judgment confused. It does not arrive disoriented or only partially informed. It arrives in a condition of supernatural clarity, the same clarity that the demonic possesses in its natural operations, full intellectual apprehension, instant complete understanding, which means that what the soul knows in that first moment, in that first instant after death, is the totality of the situation it has chosen into. It sees its own life, every act, every omission, every hardening of the will, every moment where grace was offered and refused, every time mercy was extended and turned away from, not in a distorted way, not filtered through self-justification or rationalization, in the same unfiltered clarity with which God sees it. And in that instant, the soul, judges itself. This is what the tradition means by the particular judgment. God does not impose a verdict from outside the soul's own understanding. The soul, in the clarity of that moment, comprehends with perfect lucidity what it chose and what that choosing means. The judgment is not external to the soul. It is the soul's own clear-eyed assessment of itself in the light of truth it can no longer avoid. For the soul that is lost, that moment of clarity is the beginning of something that never ends. Now, I want to get specific because the tradition, and I'm drawing here on Aquinas, on the mystics who received direct revelations about these realities, on the confirmed private revelations that the Church has not repudiated, and on certain things that I have heard in the context of the rite that I have never spoken about publicly before now, the tradition gives us specific details about what follows that first moment. The first experience of the damned soul in the teaching of the great theologians is absolute solitude. And I do not mean solitude in the way we use that word when we describe an introvert's pleasant afternoon. I mean a solitude of a depth and quality that has no analog in human experience, because it is not merely the absence of other people. It is the absence of the divine presence that, even in the lives of the most hardened sinners on earth, provided a kind of background warmth to existence, a metaphysical companionship that pervades all of created reality simply because God sustains all of created reality in being at every moment. In hell, that sustaining presence is experienced as withdrawn from the soul's communion. The soul is sustained in being because the tradition is clear that God does not annihilate souls. Annihilation would be a mercy the damned do not receive, but sustained without the quality of presence that makes existence in any way bearable. What remains when that quality is removed is not neutral. It is not simply nothing. It is the experience of an absence so total that every human experience of loneliness, isolation, or alienation is to it as a shadow is to the object that casts it. I have asked the question in the context of the rite. I have asked what that first moment feels like. I do not do this for curiosity. I do it because the answers, compelled against the entity's own will, serve the ministry by giving those present a visceral understanding of what is at stake. And what I have heard on more than one occasion, in more than one language, from more than one entity that I have established has been in that place, is consistent, unnervingly, precisely consistent. The word that appears most often across different cases, different possessed individuals, different exorcism sessions spanning years, is this: abandoned, not tormented, not burning, not punished in the way we might imagine a child imagines punishment. Abandoned, with a completeness and a permanence and a totality that reduces everything else, all the positive suffering, all the additional pains, to secondary status. Because the primary wound, the wound that underlies all the others, is simply this: you chose against the only thing that could make existence bearable, and now you know it, and you will always know it, and it will never change. What the demons revealed about the architecture. I want to pause here and address something directly, because I know there is a legitimate question in the minds of some of you who are still watching. You are asking whether the testimony of demons can be trusted. You are asking whether entities whose defining characteristic is deception can be reliable sources of information about anything, including their own domain. It is a sophisticated question, and it deserves a direct answer. The Church's theology of compelled revelation in the context of the rite is nuanced on exactly this point. Demons lie. It is not merely that they sometimes lie. It is that lying is as natural to them as breathing is to us. Our Lord himself identifies the devil as the father of lies, and this is not poetic language. It is an ontological description of a being whose entire orientation is against truth. However, this is a crucial distinction that the tradition draws very carefully. There are moments in the rite when entities are pressed by the authority of Christ operating through the prayers of the Church, pressed in ways that compel truthful response. Not because the demon becomes honest, but because the spiritual authority bearing down on it is so absolute that even the will to deceive cannot fully function. In these moments, the things that emerge carry a quality that is entirely different from the ordinary speech of a manifesting entity during exorcism. Those who have worked in this ministry long enough develop a discernment, a felt sense, of when the compelled truth is operating versus when the entity is attempting to manipulate even within the constraints of the rite. I am not asking you to take my word for this. I am asking you to note that what I have heard in those moments lines up with extraordinary precision with what the theological tradition developed over 2,000 years by men who had no access to my case files, independently arrived at through reason, scripture, and the church's defined teaching. When testimony matches independent evidence of that quality and that precision, the convergence has evidential weight. I am a trained philosopher. I do not make that claim lightly. Now, what has been revealed about the structure of hell that goes beyond what people typically imagine? The first thing is that hell is not uniform. This is something the tradition has always taught and that every serious theologian has affirmed. Aquinas is explicit about it, but it is something that popular imagination almost completely ignores. The damned do not all occupy the same condition. The degrees of punishment correspond with precise justice to the degree of culpability, the degree of the sin, the degree of the rejection of grace, the degree of the harm done to others. The soul that spent a life of casual indifference to God and died in that state does not occupy the same condition as the soul that spent a life in the deliberate, informed, knowing rejection of grace, the cultivation of evil, and the active corruption of others. This is not a comforting distinction in the way some people want it to be. It does not mean that any form of hell is tolerable. It means that the justice of God is perfect. Something that the tradition insists is actually a cause for awe rather than complaint, because a God whose justice was imperfect would be a God whose mercy was also imperfect and whose love would ultimately mean nothing. The second thing, the pain of sense, the positive, active suffering beyond the pain of loss, begins at the moment of death for the soul and intensifies after the final judgment when soul and body are reunited in the resurrection. The tradition teaches that the resurrection is universal. Every human being who has ever lived will be resurrected. The damned will be resurrected into a state in which the body permanently and perfectly expresses the condition of the soul. And that reunion, the tradition teaches, is not a mercy for the damned. It is an addition to their suffering. I have been asked in interviews what I think about that. My honest answer is that it is one of the doctrines I find most difficult, not because I doubt it, I do not, but because the full weight of what it means is almost too large to sit with for long periods of time. The third thing I want to describe is what I have heard about time in hell, or rather about what replaces time. Because one of the consistent details that has emerged across multiple compelled disclosures is that hell's relationship to time is fundamentally different from what we experience here and from what the tradition describes of heaven. In heaven, eternity is experienced as a fullness, as a plenitude, in which every moment contains complete joy rather than as an endless linear sequence. In hell, the tradition's account, and what I have heard confirmed, is that eternity is experienced not as fullness, but as an endless repetition of the moment of judgment. The soul does not move forward through time in the way we move forward through life. It experiences in an ongoing and unrelenting way the clarity of what it chose and what that choosing cost, not as a memory revisited, as a present reality that does not pass. When I first heard this described in the context of the rite, I did not have a theological category for it. I went back to Aquinas afterward. I went back to the mystics who had received revelations on this subject. And what I found was that the tradition had been saying exactly this for centuries in slightly different language, and that I had somehow not fully absorbed it until I heard it from a source that had no reason to say it and every reason to say something else. The three doors that lead there and why most people walk through them without knowing. I want to shift now from the description of hell to something more immediately practical, because the purpose of everything I have told you in the first 4 sections is not to generate dread for its own sake. Dread without direction is just suffering. What I want to give you is dread with direction, the kind that has historically produced the most significant and lasting conversions, the kind that moves people not toward despair, but toward the only actions that can change the trajectory. There are 3 primary spiritual dispositions that the tradition identifies as the conditions most predictively associated with the loss of the soul. I have seen all 3 in my pastoral and exorcism ministry. I have seen them in people of every educational level, every social class, every degree of formal religious participation. And I want to describe them honestly because in my experience, most people who are in one of these conditions do not know it. The first is presumption. Presumption is not the same as confidence. It is not the same as a healthy trust in God's mercy. It is a specific spiritual vice that the tradition identifies as the mirror image of despair. Both are sins against hope, one in excess, one in deficiency. And it is, in my observation, the most widespread spiritual danger in the contemporary West. Presumption is the assumption that God's mercy operates without reference to the will of the creature, that because God is love and because Christ died for all, and because the Church teaches universal salvation as a possibility, the actual choices of the individual soul are functionally irrelevant to its final destination, that you can defer conversion indefinitely because the mercy of God will inevitably cover whatever distance remains at the moment of death. This is a lie, not a misunderstanding, a lie. And it is one of the most effective the enemy has ever deployed because it is made entirely out of true statements arranged to produce a false conclusion. God's mercy is infinite. That is true. Christ's death is sufficient for every sin of every human being who has ever lived. That is true. The Church does not teach that any particular person is certainly damned. That is true. But none of these truths, not one, implies that the soul that chooses against God until the last moment, that treats the infinite mercy as a safety net enabling indefinite delay of conversion, that refuses to avail itself of the sacramental channels through which that mercy is actually communicated, none of it implies that such a soul is therefore automatically saved. The mercy of God does not override the freedom of the creature. It respects it, even to the very end, even when what the creature chooses with that freedom is the creature's own perdition. I have worked with people who were dying, people in hospital rooms, people in the final weeks and months of terminal illness, and I have watched the spiritual landscape of a soul under those conditions, and I will tell you what I know with 20 years of that experience behind me. The deathbed conversion is real. I have witnessed it. The mercy of God extends to the final breath and beyond the final breath to the final interior act of the will. I do not doubt this. But I have also watched what happens when a soul has spent a lifetime in presumption, when it has treated conversion as something always available and therefore always deferrable. When it arrives at that final threshold, having never developed the spiritual muscles that conversion requires, having never learned to recognize grace, having never cultivated the interior habits that make a genuine last-moment turning possible. And what I can tell you from direct observation is this: the deathbed is an extremely difficult place to begin a conversion that was never started anywhere else. The second disposition is what I would call spiritual sleepwalking. This is perhaps the most dangerous category because it looks from the outside like faith. These are people who were baptized, who were raised in Christian homes, who attend services occasionally or even regularly, who identify themselves as believers, who have never formally rejected God or the Church, but who have allowed the interior life to atrophy completely while maintaining the external structures. They pray if they pray by rote. They receive the sacraments if they do, without preparation or interior engagement. They have not consciously turned away from God. They have simply allowed the relationship to become nominal, a cultural identity rather than a living reality, while filling the interior space that should be occupied by that relationship with everything else that the modern world provides in unlimited quantity. The tradition has a word for the underlying condition here, acedia, often translated as sloth, but that translation loses the specific spiritual precision of the original. Acedia is not laziness in the ordinary sense. It is a deadness toward spiritual goods. A state in which the soul recognizes the good, is not actively hostile to it, but finds itself unable to muster the energy to pursue it. And unlike the active sinner, who at least has the drama of the conflict, the soul in acedia tends to drift quietly, without crisis points that might force a reckoning, without the spectacular falls that sometimes produce spectacular conversions. These souls worry me more pastorally than almost any other category, because the active sinner knows there is a problem. The sleeping soul does not know. It will arrive at the threshold of eternity believing it was basically fine, and in the unfiltered light of that judgment moment, it will see for the first time the magnitude of what it allowed to atrophy while it was still possible to cultivate it. The third disposition is deliberate, chosen hardness of heart. I am going to be brief here because this category is the least common and because most people in it are not watching content like this one. Deliberate hardness of heart is the condition of the soul that has received grace, has recognized it, has understood what it was being offered, and has chosen with full deliberateness to refuse, not in a moment of weakness, not in a season of confusion, but as a sustained, informed act of the will repeated over time until it becomes something close to the soul's defining characteristic. The tradition teaches that this condition pushed to its ultimate extreme becomes what St. Thomas calls the sin against the Holy Spirit, not a single act, but a disposition, a settled orientation of the will away from God that persists until death. And the traditional teaching on this sin is among the most sobering passages in the entire body of Catholic theology, because it does not say that God is unable to forgive it. It says that the soul in this condition is, by definition, unable to ask for forgiveness in a way that opens it to receive what is being offered. The problem is not God's willingness. The problem is the soul's capacity, which has been progressively destroyed by its own choices. What the saints saw, and why it confirms everything I want to spend a section on the mystics, because the Church has a remarkable body of specifically approved accounts of mystical experience of hell, not approved as doctrine, but approved as credible private revelation consistent with defined teaching, and the specificity and consistency of these accounts is something that I think deserves more attention than it typically receives. Saint Teresa of Avila, who is not a credulous woman, one of the greatest intellects the Church has ever produced, a doctor of the Church, a woman who subjected her own interior experiences to rigorous critical examination, described a vision of hell that she received in the 16th century. She described it as a place of unspeakable compression, a narrowness that seemed to crush without crushing, a heat that was unlike physical fire, but penetrated the soul directly. She said that the experience lasted what seemed to her a very short time and that she was in agony for years afterward, not from the memory, but from the continued visceral impression of it. St. John Bosco in the 19th century received a vision of hell that he described to his students and that was later written down in accounts that have been widely circulated in the Church. He described souls in states of torment that were specifically calibrated to the sins that characterized their lives, souls trapped in the instruments of the pleasures they pursued, and he described the atmosphere as one of total absence of hope. Not the temporary despair that afflicts people in this life, which always contains within it the possibility of change, but a despair that was total because it was accurate. The soul in hell despairs not because it is deceived about its situation. It despairs because it sees its situation with perfect clarity and knows that clarity is permanent. The children of Fatima, Lucia, Francisco, and Jacinta were shown a vision of hell in 1917 that the Church has examined for over a century. The description they provided from 3 children with no theological training and no framework for processing what they saw lines up with the theological tradition in ways that cannot be accounted for by coincidence. They described a vast sea of fire, souls being tossed in the flames like transparent burning embers, the shrieks and groans and cries, and above all the expression on the faces of the souls, an expression that Lucia described as one of despair and horror, not pain alone, despair. The specific spiritual suffering that is the signature of the pain of loss. What I find most significant across all of these accounts is not the physical descriptions, which vary in their specific imagery, but the consistent signature of what I would call the quality of the interior experience. Every credible mystical account of hell describes, first and above all else, the complete and permanent absence of hope, not the absence of comfort, not the absence of pleasure, the absence of hope. Because hope, the theological virtue, is ordered toward a future good, and in hell there is no future good. There is only the eternal present of what was chosen and cannot be unchosen. When I encountered that same description, that same specific quality coming from the mouth of a possessed individual in the context of the rite, from an entity that was not recounting a mystical experience but speaking from its own existence, and when what it described matched with that precision what Teresa and Bosco and the Fatima seers had independently reported, I did not need any additional evidence. The convergence was complete. Now let me tell you what the rite revealed that I have never spoken about on camera until today. The detail I could not find in any book. I have been careful throughout this talk to distinguish between what the theological tradition teaches, what approved mystical accounts describe and what I have encountered directly in the context of the rite. I'm going to be careful in this section as well, because what I'm about to tell you is in the third category, and the third category requires the most careful handling. In a case approximately 7 years ago, I will not provide details that would identify the individual. We had established through the extended course of the rite across multiple sessions that the entity manifesting had a specific category of knowledge about hell that went beyond what I had encountered before. Not more extensive knowledge. All of these entities have extensive knowledge of that domain, but a willingness under the extreme pressure of a particularly intense session of the rite to speak about it in a specific and structured way. The question I asked within the form of the rite's compelled interrogation was about the first experience of a newly arrived soul, the first hours, if time can be said to function in any meaningful way in that state. What actually happens, not in abstract theological terms, but in the experiential terms of what the soul encounters. What emerged across that session in Latin and in English, alternating in a way that entities sometimes do when the compelled pressure is at its highest, was this: the soul arrives knowing. I have said this already because the tradition has always taught it. But the entity elaborated on this in a way I had not previously considered. It said that the knowing is not merely intellectual. It is not the arrival of information. It is the arrival of full weight. What it means is this: all human beings in this life know intellectually that they will die. They know intellectually that their choices have eternal consequences. But the knowledge exists behind a kind of veil, the same veil that allows us to drive past a cemetery and not be completely undone by the reality of our mortality, that allows us to eat breakfast and not spend every moment in existential crisis about the fragility of everything. The veil is, in a certain sense, a mercy. It allows the business of life to continue. At the moment of death, the entity said, the veil comes down, all of it, permanently. And every soul, even the soul that spent its entire life ignoring these realities, experiences the full weight of what it knew without being willing to act on knowing. Not new information, the full weight of information it already had, that it chose to live as if it didn't have. And then it said something that I had to stop the rite to write down. It said that the worst suffering of the first hours, worse than the pain of loss in its raw form, worse than the positive suffering that accompanies it, is the comprehensive and unrelenting memory of every moment of grace that was refused. Not forgotten grace, not grace that the soul was unaware of. Every moment when something was offered and the soul turned from it, played out with the full clarity that the now unveiled intellect possesses, in a review that the tradition has sometimes described as the particular judgment's content, but that this entity described as something ongoing, something that does not conclude when the judgment concludes, but that continues as a permanent feature of the soul's experience. Every prayer that was not prayed when the movement to pray was felt and dismissed, every confession that was put off, every mercy that was received and not reciprocated, every person who was wronged and never sought forgiveness from, every moment when the door to grace stood open and the soul chose to walk in a different direction, played out, with complete clarity, in full weight, permanently. I sat with that for a long time after that session. I sat with it in prayer. I brought it to my confessor. I brought it to my spiritual director. And what they both told me independently was the same thing. The tradition has always said this, but we have not always said it clearly enough or often enough or with the kind of unsparing directness that actually reaches people before it is too late. And that is why I'm saying it now. The faces. People never forget. I want to tell you something about the people who come out of severe possession cases. After a true deliverance, one of those moments when the entity is expelled and the person returns to themselves, there is usually a period of some hours before they can speak coherently. The body has been through an ordeal that defies ordinary physical description, and the soul has been through something even more difficult to characterize. They need time. We give it to them. But in several of the cases where the entity had spoken extensively about hell during the course of the rite, the cases where significant portions of what I have described in this talk were revealed, when the person came back to themselves and eventually recovered enough to process what had happened, there was something consistent in what they reported about their interior experience during the possession. Not all of them remembered the words the entity spoke. Possession cases vary in how much the person retains consciousness of what occurred while the entity was fully manifest, but several of them described something similar in their subjective experience during those periods of compelled disclosure about hell. They described a sense, not exactly a vision, not exactly a dream, of proximity to something immense and cold and permanent that they could not see directly but could feel the edges of, like being near a cliff in the dark, knowing the drop is there without being able to see the bottom. And every one of them, without exception, said the same thing when they described what that proximity felt like. They said it felt like the last chance. Like the entire experience was the last warning flare before a darkness that had no more warnings in it. They described a quality of urgency, not fear exactly, not panic, but the specific sensation of understanding that the difference between that proximity and actual arrival was a difference that mattered more than anything they had ever previously believed mattered. I am not sharing these accounts because I think they constitute theological evidence. They do not. I am sharing them because they illustrate something pastorally important. The proximity to those realities, even at the degree of distance that possession cases provide, produces a transformation in the people who survive them that is absolute and irreversible. Not one of the individuals from those cases has returned to the life they were living before. Not one. I have tracked them. I have maintained pastoral relationships with them. I have watched what the proximity to those realities does to a human soul that comes back from it. It burns away the trivial in a way that nothing else I have ever witnessed does. The person who comes out of that experience does not need to be convinced that the spiritual life matters. They do not need motivational arguments or theological demonstrations. They know the way you know the temperature of a fire you have put your hand near, not from a book, from the encounter. The tragedy is that most people will not have that kind of encounter. Most people will drift toward the end of their lives through the ordinary fog of distraction and presumption and spiritual sleepwalking without anything so dramatic intervening to shake them awake, which means that something else must serve that function. And in my experience, the most effective substitute for that kind of direct encounter is the simple, clear, unsparing truth stated plainly by someone who has been close enough to these realities to speak about them without abstraction. That is what I am attempting to do. Whether I am succeeding is between you and God. What God's mercy actually looks like in this context, I have spent the majority of this talk in darkness. That was necessary. But I want to spend this section on something that, in my experience, is actually more astonishing than the darkness. And I know I have said something like this before. I want to say it again more precisely. The existence of hell, properly understood, is not an argument against God's mercy. It is one of the most profound expressions of it. I want you to sit with that for a moment because I know it sounds paradoxical, and I know your instinct may be to resist it. Here's what I mean. The God of Christian revelation is a God who so fundamentally respects the freedom of the creature that he will not override it even when its exercise destroys the creature, not because he is indifferent to the creature's destruction, but because the alternative, a God who overrides human freedom for the creature's own good, is a God whose love is actually control. A God who saves every soul regardless of that soul's will is not the God who became incarnate, who died on a cross, who rose from the dead, who offers himself in the Eucharist, who established a church with sacraments and authority. That God does not need to do any of those things. He could simply override the problem. The God who did all of those things, who came that far, who paid that price, that God is respecting the freedom of the creature at extraordinary cost to himself, and that same respect extends to the final judgment. The soul that has definitively, finally, ultimately chosen against God is not rejected by a God who has grown impatient. It is received, if received is even the right word, into the condition it has chosen, into the permanent absence of what it consistently refused. The mercy of God in this context is not the mercy that removes consequences. It is the mercy that extended every possible invitation, that pursued every soul with a relentless, patient, non-coercive love that left every door open until the door closed from the inside. In the exorcism room, when a deliverance happens, when the thing is gone and the person is themselves again, I often think about that structure, about the fact that what just happened was not primarily a victory over the demonic. It was a person being given back to themselves, given back the freedom that was being suppressed, given back the capacity to choose, given back access to the mercy that was always available and that the possession was being used to try to make inaccessible. The entity hates the deliverance not because it loses a battle. It hates it because the person is being returned to a condition where they can still choose, where the mercy is still operative, where the door is still open. The demonic knows better than most human beings what it means when that door is still open. It knows what the alternative looks like. and it will do anything it can to prevent a soul from making use of what is available while it is still available. This is what the stakes actually are. Not an abstract theological proposition about the afterlife, not a question of cultural or denominational preference. The actual condition of an actual soul that you actually are, moving toward a threshold that you will actually cross with a capacity to affect the outcome that is available to you right now, today, in ways that are specific and concrete and historically confirmed to be effective. Confession, the Eucharist, the Rosary, consistent prayer, the sacramental life of the Church lived fully and attentively rather than nominally and intermittently. These are not religious exercises for a religious subculture. These are the specific channels through which the mercy that makes hell avoidable is actually communicated to souls that need it. I know this because I have seen what the alternative looks like. I have seen it in the eyes of people who were so close to it that they could feel the drop. And every single one of them, when they came back, said the same thing. They said, "I did not know. I did not know it was this serious." They know now. The question is whether you will wait to find out the way they did. What you do now, practically, concretely, today. This is the section where I stop describing and start prescribing, because everything I have told you across this talk is only valuable if it produces action. A warning that generates no response is just noise. And I have not spent this much time and this much spiritual energy describing these realities so that you can find them interesting and move on. I want to give you 5 concrete actions, not suggestions, not optional additions to a spiritual life that is otherwise comfortably established. If what I have described in this talk is true, and I believe it is with every cell of my body and every corner of my intellect and every piece of my 20-plus years of direct experience, then these are not optional. First, go to confession. If you have not been in months, go this week. If you have not been in years, go this week with a priest who can give you the time you need. If there is something you have never confessed because it is too difficult or too shameful or too buried, that is the specific thing you most need to confess. The tradition is clear, and the exorcism cases confirm it with visceral specificity, that unconfessed sin creates the exact kind of spiritual vulnerability I have been describing. Not metaphorically, actually. Second, receive the Eucharist worthily and attentively. If you have been receiving without being in a state of grace, stop until you have confessed. If you have been receiving casually, without preparation, without interior engagement, begin preparing. Read the prayers of preparation. Spend time before Mass in recollection. Understand as concretely as you are capable of understanding what you are actually approaching. The cases I have described in which a concealed host produced the same visceral terror as an exposed one, that is a level of real presence that your casual reception should be calibrated to. Third, pray the Rosary. I know how that sounds to those of you who are not from this tradition. I know it sounds like a Catholic peculiarity. I am telling you from direct operational evidence gathered in rooms where the presence of the demonic was not a metaphor, that this prayer has a specific and measurable effect in the spiritual warfare context that I cannot explain by any mechanism other than what the tradition says it is. Begin it, even imperfectly, even if it feels rote. The fruit comes. Fourth, address the unforgiveness in your life. The theological tradition is specific and the pastoral experience confirms it. Harbored unforgiveness creates a spiritual condition that these entities exploit with particular efficiency. Not because the people who wronged you didn't wrong you. They may have wronged you profoundly. But the unforgiveness is a chain that binds you, not them. The act of forgiveness, not the emotion, not the feeling, the act of the will, closes a door that otherwise stays open. Fifth, and most importantly, do not presume. Do not treat the mercy of God as a guarantee that the choices you are making now will be covered by a deathbed grace that you have no assurance of reaching the state to receive. Do not defer the conversion that is being called for right now, in you, in the specific circumstances of your life, for any reason. Because the capacity to respond to that call is not something that will necessarily remain available indefinitely. The soul that hardens itself progressively becomes progressively less able to respond. And the point at which that hardening becomes irreversible is not announced. It does not come with a warning, or rather, it does come with a warning. You are receiving it right now. I am asking you, I am urging you with every pastoral authority I possess to take what you have heard in this talk and let it do what it is designed to do. Let it move you. Let it frighten you, if that is what it takes, into the actions that the fear rightly ordered toward vigilance and conversion will produce. Because the alternative to being frightened into conversion now is not a comfortable life, followed by a comfortable eternity. The alternative for a soul on a trajectory that has not yet been corrected is eventually an experience of those realities I have described, not at one remove, not through the testimony of exorcists and mystics and compelled demonic disclosure, but directly, personally, permanently. I have stood in rooms that were close to that edge. I have watched what proximity to those realities does to people. And I have watched what the grace of God available right now, today, through the church and its sacraments does to people who avail themselves of it. There is no comparison, not even close. Choose while choosing is still available to you. Go to confession, pray, receive, forgive, stay awake. This is not a lecture. This is an urgent message from someone who has been close enough to see clearly. And what I see clearly is this: the door is still open for you today. Do not wait until it isn't.